The summer of 1978 pressed down on Milfield, Pennsylvania, like a heavy hand refusing to let go. The town's clapboard houses seemed to shimmer in the sweltering heat, paint blistering on the porches, lawns browning beneath a relentless July Sunday. The air conditioner units rattled in upstairs windows, though most were too weak to provide more than a wheezing breath of cool air. Time itself seemed to slow, melting into the asphalt like tar bubbles that popped and released the smell of oil. It was July 23rd, the sort of day when the radio in every kitchen or corner store played Fleetwood Mac and Rod Stewart back to back. Teenagers passed through in their cut-off shorts and feathered hair, humming the latest songs and clutching glossy movie magazines. Star Wars posters, already fading from too much sunlight, were taped crookedly in bedroom windows, reminders of worlds that felt infinitely far from Milfield. But in this town, summer was not about galaxies. It was about swimming holes, 4th of July parades, and long evenings when the shadows stretched but the air never cooled. On Sycamore Street, in a modest two-story colonial, one 8-year-old Elizabeth Blackwell folded bell-bottom jeans into a brown leather suitcase. Her younger sister Abigail sprawled across the twin bed, absently twirling her honey-blonde hair, watching Lizzie's every move as though trying to memorize them. The room itself bore witness to the mid-70 seconds teenage world, John Travolta striking a pose from Saturday Night Fever on one wall, Farrah Fawcett's red swimsuit smile on another, a faint warble of a record player in the corner. Lizzie's auburn hair caught the afternoon light as she moved, her freckles bright against skin already tanned from early summer afternoons by Lake Morrison. She was the first in her family to make it to college, accepted at Penn State. A dream so large it felt almost out of place in this small Pennsylvania town. "You don't have to go, you know," Abigail muttered, her voice almost drowned by Rod Stewart crooning from the radio. "Who's going to protect me from Dad when he drinks?" Lizzie smiled, though it was the kind of smile that never reached her hazel eyes. "Mom will," she said quietly. She folded a denim skirt and placed it neatly on top of her blouses. "And I'll be home for Thanksgiving." 3 months isn't so long, but in the pause that followed, the truth lingered unsaid. Abigail knew her sister wasn't just leaving Milfield. She was leaving them, leaving the weight of arguments muffled through bedroom doors, the long silences at the dinner table, the smell of whiskey that clung to their father's work shirts. College wasn't just an opportunity, it was escape. What neither girl knew as they exchanged glances across that shared bedroom was that escape would never come. Lizzie would never set foot on the campus of Penn State, and Abigail would never see her 16th birthday. By nightfall, both sisters would vanish into the kind of silence that swallows entire families. The sun had already begun to sag behind the treetops when neighbors last spotted the Blackwell girls walking down the narrow path toward Lake Morrison. The trail was familiar, winding through thick woods that smelled of pine and damp earth. Their bicycles, old Schwinn's with squeaky chains, clattered to a stop by a tree near the shore. Towels unfurled across the sand, a half-eaten packet of Twinkies and 2 glass bottles of Tab soda placed neatly beside them as though the sisters had expected to return in just a moment. But the lake was unnervingly still, the kind of stillness that makes a person lean in to listen. Crickets sang in the distance, the sun dipped lower, and time seemed to fold in on itself. When the last neighbors returned home for supper, they assumed the sisters would soon be pedaling back up Sycamore Street, hair dripping from an evening swim. They never did. By the time their mother returned from her shift at Woolworth's, the house was empty, the television flickering against the walls in an empty living room. Dishes from lunch sat abandoned in the sink, the cuckoo clock in the hallway clicked past the hour, and the air carried that peculiar weight like the moment just before a storm breaks. Mary Blackwell called out for her daughters. Only silence answered, and so began the longest night Milfield would ever endure. The phone began its metallic ringing before Mary Blackwell could steady her hands. She dialed Abigail's best friend, Elizabeth's lab partner, the neighbor, who sometimes drove them to choir practice. No one had seen the girls since late afternoon, they said. They were probably lingering at the lake. They would come home when the mosquitoes got bad. Mary set the receiver down and lifted it again almost immediately, as if a different angle might draw her daughters back through the line. When Richard Blackwell shouldered through the front door at 10, his bowling shirt smelled of beer and lane wax. He paused when he saw Mary's face, its hollowed cheeks, the way her fingers shredded a damp paper towel into confetti. "They're not back?" he asked, and the alcohol seemed to evaporate from his breath. He grabbed the Ford Limited keys from the bowl by the door, the ring clattering like a bell. The night was a furnace. Heat radiated off the street in wavering curtains as Richard gunned the engine toward Lake Morrison. Streetlights thinned to darkness, tires hissed on gravel, and the radio dial glowed the color of a coal. He came on the lakeshore fast, headlights raking across trees. 2 bikes leaned against a trunk as obediently as if the girls would return at any second. Towels lay spread on the ground, a careless still life of summer. Twinkies yawning open, 2 empty soda bottles winking in the beams. The water itself offered nothing, no ripple, no splash, a black pane of glass under a half-sunk moon. "Lizzie, Abby," Richard's voice cracked and went hoarse. The sound went out, struck the far bank and came back thinner. He swept the shoreline, shoes sinking into damp sand, the beam of a hand flashlight jerking over cattails and discarded bait containers. He waded up the narrow path and down again, calling, as if calling hard enough could force a door open somewhere in the dark. By 11:38 p.m., the Milfield Police Department's dispatcher had notified Chief Daniel Morgan. He arrived in a tan short-sleeve uniform and a face carved by years of sleeping in bursts. Small-town chiefs are used to break-ins that turn out to be raccoons and arguments that turn out to be neighbors watching the same TV show too loud. But the words "two girls," Lake Morrison, and "bicycles left behind" pull a different thread inside a person. Morgan put on his hat slowly, as if weighing something, and started making calls. There was no 911 system in Milfield in 1978. Calls hopped between operators like stones across a creek. Volunteers arrived in pickups with dented fenders, headlights yawning at the water, flashlights crisscrossed like a tangle of pale eels, beams jumping from log to log. A pair of coaches from the high school brought a small outboard skiff, its paint flaking, the motor coughing awake after 2 pulls. A deputy walked the shoreline dragging a rope with an anchor tied to one end, an old fisherman's method for snagging anything hidden below. Someone fetched kerosene lanterns. Someone brought a thermos of coffee already going stale. Chief Morgan divided the bodies without raising his voice. Grid the North Shore, 2-man teams, no heroics. He spoke into a handheld police radio that weighed like a brick, its antenna snagged in the pine boughs when he moved. He kept a notebook in his breast pocket and a pencil behind his ear. Each name went down with a line next to it. The circle grew. The town put on its boots. The night held a texture of sounds that, if you listened long enough, could convince you you'd heard a reply. Insect choruses soared the air. The outboard groaned and settled into a steady burble. The slap of water against aluminum hulls made a heartbeat. Every few minutes someone called a name and the name came back wrong. It felt impossible that the girls were not there because their things were, and because the lake had always given back what it took. Lost fishing poles washed ashore. Canoes drifted into reeds. Even secrets, the town liked to say, eventually bobbed up like driftwood. A volunteer found a single flip-flop in the reeds and held it up as if it were a verdict. "It's Abby's," Mary said, arriving with Chief Morgan's deputy and a blanket around her shoulders she did not remember taking. She put the sandal to her chest the way a person might hold a small bird. Richard stood apart, stunned into a furious quiet, staring at the place where the towels lay. He knelt, touched the damp terry cloth as though listening. The chief spoke with him gently, then wrote another note he did not show anyone. At the water's edge, 2 officers worked a drag line between them, stepping in measured half-moons. It was clumsy, old-fashioned, but it was what they could do. They had no sonar. They had no helicopter with a searchlight that could turn night to day, only the skiff's flashlight duct-taped to a broken broom handle. "Slow," Chief Morgan called. "Keep it slow. A dragline too fast passes right over what it means to catch." Back in town, a switchboard operator called the on-call nurse, the pastor, the guy who owned the hardware store and always open no matter the hour. He showed up with extra batteries and a crate of flares nobody had asked him to bring, because flares felt like action. The flares hissed spectrally, painting the tree trunks a campfire red, burning down to their steel teeth and falling into the sand with a small sigh. Midnight passed, then 1. The heat refused to lift. The air crawled under shirt collars and into boots. The outboard skiff made slow figure eights, while a reserve deputy leaned over the bow, sweeping his light in dazing arc. He paused at a patch of lily pads, the beam whitening their undersides, and for a second everyone held their breath. A turtle blinked, ancient and indifferent, and slipped under. The boat's wake shook the lilies and they laid themselves flat, then stood again. Chief Morgan kept time with his pencil. He logged where the draglines had been, where the volunteers had no business going, what he would need at dawn. More men, a larger craft from the county reservoir unit, as a dog team if he could get one from 3 counties over. He wrote in a blocky script worn down by years of incident reports, the kind that kept only what mattered and left the rest to memory. "Chief," a deputy called, "we got tire impressions on the access road." He gestured with his flashlight. On the powdery calish, patterns of chevrons and sipes glowed like fossil leaves. "Get plaster?" the deputy asked, already knowing the answer. They would photograph the impressions, measure the width and track, and hope no one drove over them before dawn. The county lab could cast them in the morning if the humidity didn't collapse the edges first. At 2:17 a.m., a boy in a damp t-shirt insisted he had heard a scream from the North Shore at dusk. His friends hovered behind him, unconvincingly sober. "Could have been foxes," an older man muttered. The chief wrote the boy's name anyway because sometimes the tremulous, compromised accounts point to something true in a place you don't expect. He sent 2 officers to sweep the north bank again. Mary sat on an overturned milk crate, blanket clamped tight at her throat. Every once in a while she stood up as if pulled by a string and looked down the path, The way the girls would walk back, still talking, still not finished with their day. She would sit again and press her fingers to the flip-flop, like prayer beads that had been left out in the rain. Dawn is not generous when it arrives after a night like that. It comes grey and thin, showing you everything you missed and nothing you hoped. The lake shed its blackness and became water again. The far bank resolved into sedges and aluminum cans and a hanging branch that had looked, for one long hour, like a girl's arm. Mosquitoes strafed the backs of necks. Coffee burned in paper cups. The searchers looked like they had been poured into their clothes and forgotten. Dirt scored their shins where brambles reached. The chief's voice was hoarse and even. "Take a break, then we keep going." He sent someone for the high school gym keys. They would need a place to stage tables, phones, maps. They would need to be organized past the point of exhaustion, because organization was the only proof they were not drowning too. A reporter from WPEN showed up in a station wagon with magnetic call letters slapped on the door. He stood by the hood, taking notes on a spiral pad, careful to avoid Mary's eyes. He would go live after the 8 o'clock song block with a voice muted to the proper solemnity. 2 local teens missing. Last seen at Lake Morrison. Community mobilized. He would strike the tone that tries to give people both urgency and permission to hope. On the shore, Chief Morgan looked out over the water and saw exactly what the rest of Milfield would see when the sun rose 1 inch higher. 2 towels, 2 bottles, 2 bikes, no girls. The arithmetic was unforgiving. He wanted the answer to be in the reeds or the mud or the long shallow shelf that ran 30 yards out and then dropped. He wanted it to be anywhere he could point to, measure, and write down. He wanted, secretly and guiltily, for the outboard to snag on something so he could stop asking the question the lake would not answer. Instead, the boat traced another slow arc. The dragline came up clean. A crow barked once and went silent. The flare box sat empty and the sand cooled a fraction. When the sun finally broke the trees, it lit the bicycle's first chrome, winking like a signal, and made the soda bottles shine as if freshly washed. The scene looked arranged. That was the worst of it. Chief Morgan slid the pencil behind his ear and closed the notebook. "We set the command center at the high school," he said quietly. "We'll need maps, phone lines, a roster. We'll work the lake and the roads. We'll knock on every door." He did not say the other thing, the thing every searcher already felt in their bones as the heat began its second day, that sometimes the brightest lights only show you how deep the dark is. The morning air carried the scent of wet pine needles and exhausted bodies. By 8 o'clock, the Milfield Chronicle had already run its presses with a headline that struck like a hammer. "Local teens vanish from Lake Morrison." The words were set in type large enough to shout across a street. Beneath it, 2 black and white school photographs stared out. Elizabeth Blackwell with her confident smile, Abigail with the softer, hesitant grin of a girl who still half believed childhood hadn't ended. WPEN radio interrupted its rotation of Neil Diamond and Billy Joel to deliver a somber bulletin. "The Blackwell sisters have not been located," the announcer intoned, his baritone trying to balance calm with dread. "Community volunteers are joining police in a coordinated search effort. Anyone with information is urged to call the Milfield Police Department immediately." On kitchen counters and in parked cars, the words settled like a film of ash. By late morning, the high school gymnasium had transformed into a command center. Folding tables stretched in rows across the hardwood floor, their varnish scuffed by the hurried shuffle of chairs. Push-button telephones were wired in a line, their cords twisted and prone to tangling. A corkboard stood at one end of the room, a large county map pinned across it. Colored pushpins multiplied with each reported sighting or dead-end lead. A red pin for the North Shore screams, a blue pin for the van sighting, yellow pins for door-to-door searches. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, sweat, and the endless drip of percolating coffee in metal urns. Chief Morgan, who had been awake nearly 30 hours, stood before the map like a conductor before an orchestra missing half its instruments. His notepad bulged with names, license plates, half-remembered statements. Every line of it was fragile, every lead a thread that frayed as soon as it was tugged. The leads as they emerged were a strange chorus. A gas station attendant swore he'd seen a dark-colored van with out-of-state plates parked by the access road. He remembered it because the driver paid with crumpled bills and asked where the nearest campground was. But when pressed, he couldn't remember the man's face. 3 teenagers told police they had heard a scream from the lake's north side, though each admitted they'd been drinking stolen beer and might have mistaken an owl's cry for something human. Elizabeth's best friend, Jessica Turner, confessed that Lizzie had hinted about an older, secret boyfriend, someone not from around here, someone she refused to name. Each detail carried weight, and yet each seemed to float. Without evidence, they were rumors. Without technology, they were nearly impossible to anchor. The investigators gathered what they could. Cigarette butts scattered near the girls' towels were placed in plastic baggies. Tire tracks pressed deep into the dirt access road were photographed, their fragile outlines collapsing under the tread of every new patrol car. The soda bottles Lizzie and Abigail had left behind were dusted for prints, though the powder clung poorly to the glass in the July humidity. Each artifact was logged, labeled, and placed into cardboard evidence boxes that looked no different from the ones used to pack away old yearbooks or Christmas decorations. But in 1978, science lagged cruelly behind. DNA testing was a science fiction dream, still years from its first courtroom debut. Fingerprints could only be compared manually, page by page, against thick binders or state files. Cigarette butts might indicate a presence, but not an identity. Tire tracks might suggest a vehicle, but never a name. Evidence, in that summer gym, was less a key than a collection of locked doors. The town rallied regardless. Volunteers phoned through every number in the rotary directory. Teenagers in cut-off shorts stapled flyers to telephone poles until their fingers blistered. Shopkeepers taped the sisters' school photos in their windows, their smiles staring back at customers who had known them since birth. The mimeograph machine at City Hall clattered endlessly, its purple ink staining fingertips with each fresh stack of missing leaflets. The smell of solvents filled the air, mingling with the sweat of men and women who could not imagine stopping. And yet, as the hours stretched into days, the urgency began to warp. Rumors grew wild, fueled by whispers in grocery lines and half-heard conversations at the tavern. Some claimed the sisters had run away, seduced by the lure of California communes. Others insisted they had been snatched by strangers in a traveling carnival that had passed through weeks earlier. In a town like Milfield, where secrets were usually as small as overdue bills or whispered affairs, the enormity of two vanished daughters felt unbearable. It had to be explained, even if the explanation bent toward fantasy. Chief Morgan watched all of it with weary eyes. He pinned notes on the board, circled areas on the map, and tried to hold the line between hope and resignation. But every hour that passed without Elizabeth and Abigail made the silence louder, the pins emptier, the evidence more inert. The lake, dark and inscrutable, loomed at the edge of it all. Its surface reflected the sky with perfect indifference, as if mocking the frenzy it had unleashed. For generations, Lake Morrison had been the town's place of relief: summer swims, stolen kisses, fishing trips at dawn. Now it was a wound. Parents began to forbid their children from going near its banks. Some swore they could hear echoes there at night, faint cries carried on the still water. In truth, the lake was keeping its own calendar, one that would not bend to Milfield's grief. And as dusk settled again over the shoreline, a thought began to haunt the townspeople. Perhaps the Blackwell sisters had never left the lake at all. By the second week, the posters on shop windows curled at the corners. Rain had blurred the ink on some, and others had been tacked over with carnival ads and yard sale notices. But Elizabeth and Abigail's eyes still watched from every telephone pole, from the glass door of the post office, as from the corkboard in the diner where regulars nursed their morning coffee and whispered about what the police had or hadn't found. The FBI sent an agent down from Philadelphia. He wore a sharp suit that looked wrong among the sweat-stained deputies and volunteer firemen. His questions were clipped, methodical, state lines, ransom notes, evidence of organized abduction. When none of those threads could be tied, his presence shrank. Without proof the sisters had been taken across jurisdictional boundaries, the Bureau's hands remained mostly folded. By the end of August, the agent was gone, leaving behind a thin file and the impression of another door closed. Others came to fill the void. Psychics drifted in from neighboring towns, drawn by desperation like moths to a porchlight. They spoke of cabins in the mountains, of girls fleeing west, of visions clouded in smoke and water. Some townsfolk listened, grateful for any story that gave the sisters breath. Others looked away, embarrassed by the spectacle of grief made into theater. Chief Morgan tolerated them for a time, then quietly ushered them out of his command post. The investigation did not need more noise. As summer tipped into fall, the vigils began. The first was luminous. Hundreds gathered by the lake, holding white tapers that shivered against the evening breeze. A minister prayed. Mary Blackwell wept openly. Richard stared at the ground, his jaw locked tight. Songs rose in uneven voices, the kind of hymns that stretched to cover both faith and fear. For one night, the town became a single body, lit by small flames and the ache of not knowing. But repetition corrodes even devotion. The second vigil drew fewer. By the 5th anniversary, only Mary, Richard, and a circle of the girls' closest friends remained by the shore, their candles sputtering in the wind. A town can carry only so much weight before it begins to set it down. Inside the Blackwell home, grief found its own routines. Mary stopped working at Woolworth's, her shifts replaced by long hours on the porch, eyes fixed on the corner where bicycles once reappeared after school. Sometimes neighbors waved, but she rarely lifted her hand in reply. Richard drowned himself in overtime at the paper mill, the roar of machinery and the scrape of pulp offering an anesthesia stronger than whiskey. When work ended, he sought the bottom of bottles at Brady's Tavern, stumbling home long after Mary had cried herself to sleep. Chief Morgan did what he could. Each year on the sisters' birthdays, he came to dinner at the Blackwell home. his large frame hunched uncomfortably over a chair that seemed too small for him. Mary baked a cake, set 5 places, and waited as though the ritual might conjure something. Afterward, Morgan would haul out the case file, now stored in a cardboard box, and walk them once again through the evidence, the cigarette butts, the tire tracks, the fingerprints. Nothing new, always nothing new. Still, he came because sometimes duty was not about solving but about witnessing. As the 1,980 seconds arrived, the case gathered dust. Officers who had searched those first frantic nights retired, moved away, or simply stopped speaking of it. The Blackwell file was pushed deeper into the archives, sandwiched between Prohibition-era ledgers and council meeting minutes no one read. Morgan himself passed in 1993, his memory of the case buried with him. The new chief, younger and unscarred by 1978, treated the Blackwell disappearance like a chapter already closed, and so Milfield adjusted, not by healing, but by scarring over. Parents told children the cautionary tale: don't wander off, don't take shortcuts, don't trust the quiet dark of Lake Morrison. Teenagers still went to swim, but always with a joke about ghosts, a nervous laugh to mask the unease. The lake became both playground and warning, beauty edged with menace. For Mary and Richard, there was no adjustment. Mary died in 2004, her heart worn out from decades of waiting. Richard followed 6 months later, his liver ruined by years of numbing himself. They were buried side by side beneath a headstone that read, "Beloved parents of Elizabeth and Abigail." 2 smaller stones flanked them, markers for daughters whose bodies were never found. Their Sycamore Street home passed to a young couple from Pittsburgh. They gutted it, painted over the years of sorrow, and filled the attic with plastic tubs of their own children's toys. It wasn't until neighbors told them the history that they realized the floorboards still carried silence. In a forgotten box tucked beneath the rafters, they found yearbooks, photographs, and a diary with girlish handwriting, Mary's shrine to the daughters who had never come home. Unsure what to do, they donated it all to the Historical Society, where the items were catalogued and placed in storage. Outside, the world changed. The Berlin Wall fell. The internet was born. Cell phones chirped in pockets. DNA testing became the new compass of justice, pointing investigators toward answers once thought unreachable. Cold cases across America flickered back to life with a single swab or a long-preserved hair, but Milfield's wound remained untouched. The sister's absence calcified into local legend, a scar that pulsed whenever the summer heat pressed down too long, whenever the lake grew too still. Grief, after all, doesn't vanish. It only learns to wait. The summer of 2017 was unlike any in Pennsylvania's recorded history. Rain clouds passed the state by as if indifferent. Rivers shrank into muddy trickles, and crops withered under skies that gave no relief. By June, the newspapers called it the worst drought the region had ever known. And at Lake Morrison, the waterline sank further each week, exposing tree stumps long forgotten, rusted beer cans from decades of picnics, and the skeletal remains of docks that had once reached into deep water. It was here, on a blistering afternoon, that a group of environmental science students from Milfield Community College trudged across the cracked bed of the lake. They were tasked with charting the ecological impact of the drought, measuring how far the shoreline had retreated. Clipboards in hand, boots sinking into mud that baked into clay, they joked about how the lake looked more like a desert now, its floor split into wide, gaping fissures. One student, 20-year-old Clara Evans, paused when something pale caught her eye in the dirt. At first she thought it was driftwood, bleached and splintered by years underwater. But when she knelt, the shape resolved into something unmistakable, a jawbone, its teeth intact, wedged in the mud as if the earth itself had clenched it tight. Her laughter died instantly. The police were called within the hour. By dusk, the shoreline buzzed with yellow tape, county cruisers, and the flashing red lights of emergency vehicles. Chief investigators crouched in the mud, whispering to one another as they flagged the area. The students stood back, shivering in the relentless heat despite the sweat plastering their shirts. The excavation began the next morning. Forensic anthropologists from the University of Pittsburgh arrived with brushes, trowels, and cameras. The process was painstaking. Mud clung to everything. Each fragment had to be freed grain by grain. Soon it became clear. There wasn't just one skeleton. There were 2. Side by side, tangled in silt, lay the remains of 2 young females. Their bones were eerily preserved by decades of cold, oxygen-poor water. Each skull bore fractures consistent with blunt force trauma. At their ankles and torsos, investigators uncovered heavy stones bound with the remnants of electrical cord that had frayed, but not completely disintegrated, in the years underwater. The scene was grimly quiet, save for the clicks of cameras and the steady scraping of tools. Forensic bags were labeled, bones wrapped and sealed. The anthropologist murmured estimates. One individual, approximately 18 years old, the other, 16. Both victims had died around the same time, at least 3 decades earlier. Whispers spread quickly through the gathered onlookers. Older residents shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances heavy with recognition. The dates, the ages, the lake, every detail pointed to the names Milfield had carried in its bones for nearly 40 years. Elizabeth and Abigail Blackwell. For a moment it felt as though the entire town exhaled at once. All those vigils, all those whispered stories in kitchens and taverns had been pointing here to this mud, to these fragile remains that had surfaced only because the water had finally given them up. But discovery was not closure. It was only the beginning. Now came the harder question. Not where the girls had gone, but who had put them there. Detective Samantha Riley, 3 years into her post with the Milfield Police Department, stood at the edge of the cordon watching the scene unfold. She was young, in her early 30s, but already carried herself with the kind of composure earned from a dozen smaller cases of burglary, assault, and domestic violence. Yet nothing in her career had prepared her for this. The lake had whispered its secret, and now it fell on her shoulders to make the bones speak. Detective Samantha Riley drove the familiar streets of Milfield with a strange sense of detachment, as if the town itself had shifted into another era overnight. Banners still hung across Main Street advertising the county fair. The ice cream parlor still offered banana splits for $2, but the whispers curling through every doorway had changed. People no longer asked, "What happened to the Blackwell girls?" They asked, "What will the police do now that the lake has spoken?" Riley was not from Milfield. She had grown up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a nurse and a postal worker. She joined the force less for glory than for the quiet conviction that truth, however ugly, mattered. Her colleagues teased her for her long runs before shift, but endurance was what she prized. And in cold cases, endurance was not just useful, it was essential. The first thing she did was walk into the Milfield Historical Society, a Victorian house converted into a museum. Dust lingered on glass cases filled with Civil War buttons, yellowed newspapers, and sepia photographs of miners with hollow eyes. The curator, Harold Jenkins, shuffled forward in suspenders, his white hair thinning but his memory sharp. "You're here about the sisters," he said before Riley had even asked. He led her to the back room, where a display case contained 2 faded photographs. Elizabeth with auburn hair cascading over her shoulders, Abigail with that tentative smile. Beneath them sat the donated box the new owners of the Blackwell home had once surrendered: yearbooks, letters, even a diary with fragile pages. Riley leaned closer, her reflection mingling with the frozen faces of the missing girls. "I was in high school when they disappeared," Jenkins said softly. "Everyone thought they'd been kidnapped, maybe taken out of state. No one imagined they might have been lying in that lake all this time." From the Historical Society, Riley drove straight to the county medical examiner's office. Dental records had survived in the old police file, carefully preserved by Chief Morgan decades earlier. One by one, the teeth were compared, the alignments matched, the conclusions drawn. The remains were indeed Elizabeth and Abigail Blackwell. What the town had long suspected was now carved into certainty. But to Riley, identification was only step one. The harder work finding out who had put them in the water remained, and that would mean resurrecting a case older than she was. She requested the original file from the police archives. What arrived was less a folder than a time capsule. Stacks of carbon-copied reports, grainy photographs, handwritten notes on yellow legal pads, even flyers smudged purple with mimeograph ink. The pages smelled faintly of mildew and cigarette smoke. Some corners had been chewed by mice. Riley spread everything across a long table and began the tedious task of digitizing. Each photograph scanned, each report transcribed into a searchable document. She built a digital timeline of the sisters' final day, plotting out every confirmed sighting, every claimed lead, every interview. She created a database of names, friends, neighbors, bystanders, suspects cross-referenced with ages, addresses, and occupations. At night, the glow of her monitor painted her office walls as she pieced together fragments left by people long retired or dead. A van with out-of-state plates, a scream on the North Shore, a rumored boyfriend. None of it fit neatly, but Riley's training had taught her that cases like this never started neat. They began as chaos, and only through relentless sorting did patterns emerge. Recognizing the need for perspective, Riley reached out to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Though the Bureau had never fully claimed jurisdiction in 1978, its modern profilers were willing to consult. They spoke of offender signatures, of situational opportunity, of the psychology of control. Their language was clinical, but to Riley it offered a new set of tools, a way to read what the evidence was trying to say across 4 decades of silence. Still, one truth pressed harder than any. Most of the original investigators were gone. Chief Morgan had been buried in 1993, his notes boxed away. Witnesses were now in their 60s and 70s, memories dulled by time, sharpened only by guilt. Evidence had degraded, chain of custody frayed. This was not going to be a sprint, but Riley was built for long distances. She was patient enough to let details ripen. In her mind, the case was no longer about reviving an old file, it was about giving two silenced girls a voice, even if it came decades late. And that voice, she suspected, might already be waiting, in the bottom of a box, in the overlooked margin of a report, or in the tarnished chain of a necklace someone once whispered about but no one had ever found. Detective Riley began her interviews with the people who had known the sisters best. She sat in the living room of Jessica Turner, now Jessica Mitchell, who had been Elizabeth's closest friend. The house was lined with photographs of children, grandchildren, and anniversaries. But Jessica's eyes grew wet as soon as Riley mentioned July of 1978. "I've lived with the guilt all these years," Jessica admitted, twisting her wedding ring. "Lizzie told me she was seeing someone older. She said people wouldn't approve. I promised not to tell, and I kept that promise, even when she disappeared. Sometimes I wonder if speaking up would have saved them." Riley leaned forward. "Did she give you anything? A name? A description?" Jessica shook her head slowly. "No name. But she did start wearing a necklace, a little silver heart. Said it was a gift from him. That necklace hadn't been mentioned in the original case file." Riley scribbled the note quickly, her instincts sparking. Later, when she reviewed the items recovered from the lake bed, she froze. Among the fragments of jewelry, a charm bracelet, a class ring lay a corroded heart-shaped pendant, tarnished but still intact. It was as if Elizabeth's secret had survived decades underwater, waiting to be found. At the state crime lab, the evidence was subjected to a level of testing unimaginable in 1978. The electrical cord once used to bind the stones to the sisters' bodies yielded something miraculous. A partial DNA profile preserved in the inner fibers, shielded by layers of silt. Not enough for a full identity, but enough to test against suspects. Clothing fragments told their own story. Chemical analysis revealed residues used in the paper pulping process, compounds unique to the Milfield paper mill, where Richard Blackwell had worked. That detail alone suggested that whoever killed the sisters had some connection to the mill, whether through employment, equipment, or contact. Meanwhile, Riley combed through witness memories. One name surfaced again and again: James Harper, a senior at Milfield High when Elizabeth was a junior. Several remembered him asking her to prom, only to be declined. Riley tracked him down to a suburb of Chicago where he now worked as an engineer. Harper was cooperative, even stunned to hear the sisters' remains had finally been found. "I liked Lizzie," he admitted, his voice carrying the embarrassment of an old rejection. "But she told me she was already seeing someone. Said he gave her rides home sometimes. She wouldn't say who, just that it was complicated." When Riley pressed, Harper added one more chilling detail. Elizabeth once hinted that the man was connected to the paper mill where her father worked. Back in Milfield, Riley dug through employment records from the 1972. Dozens of men had worked there, many long dead or scattered across the country. But the intersection of older man, secret relationship, and paper mill connection began narrowing the circle in ways the original investigators had never managed. As she stared at the database she'd built, Riley realized the past was no longer silent. The necklace, the chemical traces, the old rumors, all of it whispered a single truth. The killer had not been a stranger. He had been close enough to give a teenage girl gifts, close enough to leave paper mill chemicals on her clothes, close enough to know where the sisters would walk that night, and Elizabeth had trusted him. The diary surfaced like a ghost. It had been sitting in the archives of the Milfield Historical Society for years, its pages fragile and spotted, written in Elizabeth's looping, confident hand. Riley read it under the sterile light of her desk lamp, each sentence dragging her further into the secret world of a girl who never made it to college. Most of the entries were ordinary. Notes about homework, arguments with her mother, excitement over Fleetwood Mac's latest record. But then, scattered like landmines, came fragments about someone she only called R. R says we'll be together soon. He makes me feel safe even when I shouldn't. Abby thinks it's strange, but she's coming around. R says it'll be a fresh start for all of us. The final entry, dated July 22nd, 1978, the day before the disappearance, was the most chilling. R says everything is arranged tomorrow at the lake. A new start. Abby's excited but scared too. I told her it will be an adventure. R says we'll finally be a family, no more hiding. Riley felt her stomach knot. The implication was grotesque, unthinkable. A family, a secret relationship. The initials, R. She cross-referenced the diary with employment records from the paper mill and found what others had ignored. Richard Blackwell, Lizzie and Abigail's own father, was listed as a long-time employee in the pulping department. Supervisor's notes painted him as skilled but temperamental, a man prone to outbursts and whispered accusations of inappropriate behavior toward younger women. One report in particular stood out. In 1977, a 17-year-old employee had complained that Richard had cornered her during a late shift, making advances that bordered on threatening. The complaint was brushed aside as a misunderstanding, but soon after, the girl and her family abruptly moved out of state. Riley tracked the woman down in Arizona, now in her 50s. On the phone, her voice cracked with old anger. He told me he had special relationships with his daughters. Said they understood him in ways no one else did. I thought he was insane. I never felt safe again until we left Milfield. The pieces clicked together like a puzzle that had been waiting for decades. The diary, the chemicals, the necklace, Richard's eerie foresight when he led police straight to the girls' bicycles on that first night. He had known where to look because he had put them there. The theory sickened Riley even as she wrote it out. Richard Blackwell had been more than a grieving father. He had been the predator hiding in plain sight, the man who convinced his eldest daughter to keep a secret, who lured both girls to the lake under the promise of escape. And when Elizabeth threatened to leave for college to expose his control, he had silenced them both with stones and electrical cord. Saying it aloud felt like a betrayal of the image the town had carried for decades, the quiet mother on her porch, the grieving father searching the shoreline. But evidence doesn't bend to comfort, it bends only to truth. Still, Riley knew theory was not proof. Richard Blackwell was long dead, buried beside the wife who had never known the truth. But perhaps his body still carried the answers. If DNA recovered from the electrical cord matched his remains, the case would finally move from suspicion to certainty. It was the kind of request that chilled even seasoned prosecutors, to exhume the father who had once been called a victim and name him instead as the killer. The district attorney balked at first, calling it circumstantial. But when Riley laid the diary across the desk, its final words staring back like a confession, silence filled the room. For the first time in nearly 40 years, the truth felt close enough to touch. On a grey October morning, a backhoe stood idle at the edge of Milfield Cemetery. A small crowd of officials and onlookers gathered at a distance, their breath rising in the cool air. The grave of Richard Blackwell, beloved father, beloved husband, waited beneath the sod. For nearly 4 decades, his stone had borne silent witness to flowers left, to grieving hands brushing dirt from its surface. Now, under a court order, it would be disturbed. Detective Riley stood near the cordon, hands in the pockets of her coat, her expression unreadable. She knew this wasn't spectacle, it was necessity. To accuse a dead man of murdering his daughters was a claim that demanded proof as tangible as bone and cord. When the coffin was lifted and opened under forensic supervision, the atmosphere seemed to thicken. The remains were handled carefully, samples taken and sealed in sterile tubes. The work was clinical, but the implications weighed heavy. In those fragments of Richard's body might lie the answer that had eluded Milfield for 40 years. Weeks later, the DNA analysis came back. The partial genetic profile recovered from the electrical cord, the very cord that had dragged Elizabeth and Abigail to the bottom of Lake Morrison, was consistent with Richard Blackwell. Statistically significant, scientifically undeniable. Forensic technicians examined the old tools found among Richard's preserved belongings. Wire cutters from his paper mill days still bore microscopic wear patterns. When compared to the cuts in the recovered electrical cord, the striations matched like a signature. The cord and the cutter had once been part of the same act. With those results in hand, the district attorney convened a press conference in Milfield's town hall. The building was crowded beyond capacity, reporters with notepads, townspeople clutching folded arms, and survivors of the original search effort now grey-haired, faces lined with decades of waiting. Detective Riley stepped to the podium, cameras flashing in bursts. Her voice was steady but low, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water. The case of Elizabeth and Abigail Blackwell is now closed. Our investigation confirms that their father, Richard Blackwell, was responsible for their deaths in July of 1978. Evidence suggests Richard had been sexually abusing at least one of his daughters. When Elizabeth planned to leave for college, threatening to break his control and reveal the abuse, he murdered both girls and concealed their bodies in Lake Morrison. The room broke into a hush so profound that even the whir of the cameras seemed intrusive. Some gasped, some shook their heads in disbelief, a few wept openly. For decades, Richard had been remembered as a father stricken with grief, a man who drank himself into oblivion out of sorrow. Now, that image crumbled, revealing something monstrous beneath. Neighbors who recalled Richard's stern voice and possessive nature now re-examined those memories with new eyes. The way he always insisted on driving the girls to events, rarely letting them walk alone, the sharp temper that could flare without warning. Things once dismissed as quirks of character now took on a darker cast. In Brady's tavern, old men stared into their glasses, remembering Richard hunched over the bar, claiming no one suffered like he did. At Woolworth's, Mary's former co-workers whispered with tears in their eyes, realizing the woman they pitied for her loss had also been a prisoner of secrets she never suspected or never dared voice. Closure came, but not relief. For many in Milfield, the revelation was worse than the mystery. It was one thing to imagine a stranger's cruelty. It was another to know the horror had lived inside the very home meant to protect the sisters. At Lake Morrison, a makeshift memorial bloomed. Flowers, candles, and handwritten notes gathered on the same shore where towels and soda bottles had once been left behind. People came to stand in silence, some in mourning, others in quiet fury, all united by the knowledge that truth, however late, had finally surfaced. Peace had not come, but certainty had. Winter crept into Milfield the year the truth was finally named. Snow dusted the gravestones in the cemetery, muting the names carved in granite. Elizabeth and Abigail's remains were laid to rest again, this time not beside their parents, but in a separate plot marked by a single stone. Elizabeth and Abigail Blackwell, beloved sisters, finally at peace. The town turned out in numbers not seen since the first vigil in 1979. Men who had dragged ropes through the lake, women who had stapled flyers in the heat, children now grown who remembered their parents whispering warnings all stood shoulder to shoulder as a minister spoke. Jessica Mitchell placed flowers on the grave, her lips trembling with words she hadn't dared to say for 40 years. At the Historical Society, Harold Jenkins oversaw the installation of a permanent exhibit. It did not sensationalize. Instead, it displayed the sisters' yearbooks, the tarnished silver necklace, and the diary entries that had finally revealed the truth. A plaque read, "In memory of Elizabeth and Abigail Blackwell, may their story remind us to protect the vulnerable, even in the places we believe are safest." But the legacy of the sisters stretched beyond remembrance. Out of grief came change. Milfield established a crisis center for victims of domestic violence and abuse, named Lizzie's Place, in honor of the eldest daughter who had dreamed of becoming a teacher. Local schools introduced programs teaching students how to recognize and report abuse, giving language to fears that once went unnamed. Within the police department, a cold case unit was formed, its small team trained in modern forensic methods. "No file is ever closed," their motto read. Riley herself became a leading voice in advocating for such units nationwide. She spoke at conferences, recounting how time and silence had nearly buried two girls forever until persistence, technology, and one overlooked diary brought them back. For Milfield, the lake itself became both scar and shrine. A weathered wooden bench was placed at the north shore facing the water. Beside it, a small plaque told the story not as myth, but as history. Two sisters, lost and found, silenced and finally heard. On summer evenings, people sat there in quiet, listening to the ripples against the shore. Some swore the place felt lighter now, as if the lake itself had released its burden. Detective Riley often returned in the years that followed. She would stand at the water's edge, hands deep in her coat pockets, remembering the case that had consumed her. "Justice delayed is not justice denied," she told reporters once. "Sometimes it's just waiting for the right moment, the right person to listen." The Blackwell case became a warning, a lesson, and a promise. That silence can last decades, but not forever. That evidence, no matter how fragile, holds its tongue until someone asks the right question. That even the darkest secrets eventually rise, like bones through cracked mud, refusing to stay buried. As the waters of Lake Morrison crept back to their natural levels, covering once more the place where the sisters had rested for nearly 40 years, the community began to heal not by forgetting, but by remembering fully. Elizabeth and Abigail were no longer the smiling faces on faded flyers. They were known, mourned, and finally at peace. And Milfield, wiser and more vigilant, carried their story forward so that no other daughters would be silenced in the same way again.